The story of the German girl who, at the age of 6, began to accurately describe details of feudal Japan reached clinical archives almost by accident. The first contact came through a pediatrician in Freiburg who, disturbed by the unusual nature of the accounts, registered a preliminary dossier. The child, I will call her Clara here, preserving her original identity as per medical recommendation, presented spontaneous episodes of mild dissociation, accompanied by surprisingly specific language referring to customs, social structures, and rituals that no child her age, without direct exposure, should have mastered. What drew attention was not just the words, but the way they emerged. In a routine consultation, Clara, who had been calm until then, sighed before saying, "The sound of the shamisen would wake me before the sun." Her mother reported that the girl had never heard a Japanese instrument and that there were no Oriental objects at home. The pediatrician described the speech as intrusive memory of content not belonging to the current life repertoire, a typical clinical notation in cases of involuntary recall. These observations were forwarded to a psychotherapist specializing in trauma, who, in turn, contacted Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Although widely known for her studies on grief, Kubler-Ross dedicated part of her work to phenomena of consciousness and near-death experiences. She was already familiar, from academic reading, with the studies of Ian Stevenson, especially the documented cases where children presented consistent narratives of past lives. But here, in south-central Germany, an episode arose that demanded rigorous clinical methodology. When Kubler-Ross received the case, the interest was not in proving reincarnation, but in understanding the origin of the phenomenon. Her initial approach consisted of structured interviews with the family. The mother described an episode that occurred 3 months before the referral. During a walk, Clara stopped in front of an ornamental bamboo grove in a Freiburg park and murmured, "The Okia's garden was bigger, but the wind sounded the same." The term Okia, traditionally associated with the houses where geisha and apprentices lived, was not part of the household vocabulary. Kubler-Ross then decided to observe the child in short sessions without any induction. The goal was to record spontaneity, not stimulate imagination. In the first session, Clara analyzed a teacup placed on the table. She touched the porcelain and commented, "Mine were more delicate, and we had to hold them like this." The position of the fingers, she demonstrated, was compatible with the classic manner of serving tea during the Edo period. This correspondence was not conclusive by itself, but it was impressive due to its naturalness, not its performance. Clara's narrative did not have the fantastical character typical of a child's imagination. There were no dragons, heroes, or magical events. Instead, descriptions of learning, discipline, routine, and etiquette emerged, elements consistent with the training of a Maiko, a geisha apprentice. Kubler-Ross noted, "The child demonstrates mnemic reconstruction of high internal consistency without identifiable external stimuli." From this point on, the central question was inevitable. Where did these very specific memories come from? And why did they emerge precisely in moments of tranquility, without any emotional pressure? In the following weeks, Kubler-Ross established a systematic protocol to monitor Clara. As in any clinical case involving non-ordinary memory, the first step was to rule out environmental influences. The therapist visited the family home, checked books, toys, television programs, and even frequent conversations. Nothing suggested contact with Japanese culture beyond what would be expected in any common European home. There were no Oriental decorations, no Japanese relatives, no trips abroad. The mother herself commented, almost disconcerted, "If someone had brought that into the house, I would have known." With the environment ruled out as the primary source, Kubler-Ross focused on the phenomenology of the episodes. The recurrent pattern was striking. The memories always appeared accompanied by an altered, yet stable state of attention. It was not a trance, nor a daydream. It was a kind of distant focus, typical in some cases studied by Ian Stevenson, where the child remained lucid, but connected to a narrative flow that seemed to come from another time. In one of the most striking sessions, Clara described something that would change the course of the investigation. Sitting in the office, observing an oval mirror on the wall, she commented softly, "I learned to smile with my eyes because the paint hid my mouth." Kubler-Ross gently asked her to explain. The girl said, "When I was ready, my face was white, and my hair smelled of hot oil. It hardened when it dried." The description corresponded precisely to the traditional methods of preparing geisha during the Edo period, including the use of vegetable oils and specific pigments. The therapist noted every detail, but what impressed her most was the absence of exaggerated emotion. Clara spoke naturally, like someone describing their own school routine. This affective neutrality is considered a relevant indicator in psychiatry. Children who invent stories tend to express enthusiasm, laughter, or suspense. Clara, on the contrary, presented what Kubler-Ross classified as a non-performative descriptive account. However, the episode that resonated the most occurred during a simple drawing exercise. The therapist asked Clara to draw any place where she felt at home. The girl, without hesitation, drew a wooden structure with sliding doors, hanging lanterns, and a garden with stones close to the ground. When the mother saw the drawing, she thought it was a temple, but Kubler-Ross knew there were elements of an ochaya, a traditional tea house. To confirm, she discreetly consulted a professor of Asian studies at the University of Basel, who recognized the architectural style as characteristic of Kyoto between the 18th and 19th centuries. Even so, Kubler-Ross was cautious. In her notes, she registered, "The content is coherent, but coherence does not imply spiritual causality." The case requires multidisciplinary analysis. What intrigued her was not the exoticism of the story, but the clinical consistency. It was the kind of case that, decades earlier, had caught the attention of Ian Stevenson and led him to document hundreds of similar episodes in children in Sri Lanka, India, and the United States. The convergence between Stevenson's methods and Kubler-Ross's phenomenological sensitivity began to shape a rare investigation in which psychology, anthropology, and memory intersected unexpectedly. The investigation gained depth when Kubler-Ross decided to apply semi-structured narrative interviews, a common technique in clinical cases involving non-voluntary memory reconstructions. Instead of directly asking about Japan, she invited Clara to describe sensations, daily tasks, and interactions, allowing the content to emerge without suggestive contamination. This methodology, also used by researchers like Ian Stevenson in his most productive period, was effective in distinguishing childish invention from structured memory. On a cold January morning, as dry leaves rattled against the window of the office in Zurich, Clara began to speak more fluently than ever. This time, she didn't describe objects or routines. She talked about people. "The lady who taught me would get serious when I missed a step," she said calmly. Kubler-Ross asked what the lady was like. Clara replied, "Her hair was so heavy, it felt like it was pulling back. She told me to walk slowly because my shadow was too fast." The last sentence intrigued the therapist, not for its poetic content, but for its cultural coherence. Traditions in Maiko training included posture corrections based on the idea that the shadow revealed abrupt movements. Kubler-Ross maintained a neutral tone. "What happened after the lessons?" The girl answered, "I slept in a room with other girls. The one next to me always cried. I didn't. I wanted to learn." Nothing in Clara's behavior indicated that she was fantasizing. Children who invent stories tend to create characters with names, exaggerations, and magical elements. Clara, on the contrary, mentioned unnamed figures, as occurs in true memories, especially old ones. Furthermore, the descriptions of disciplined routine were unusual for a contemporary European child, especially without prior contact with that world. The nights, however, revealed another aspect of the case. The mother reported that at irregular intervals, Clara would wake up saying that she couldn't be late. There was no significant anxiety, but rather a feeling of duty. The child would walk to the kitchen, remain standing for a few minutes, as if waiting for instructions, and then go back to sleep. Kubler-Ross classified these episodes as fragmented behavioral script activation, a term used in psychology to describe patterns of action that seem to belong to another context of life. To deepen the study, Kubler-Ross consulted historical archives on the education and routine of Maiko in feudal Japan. The similarity between Clara's accounts and documents from the Edo period was surprising, although the therapist maintained scientific caution. In her analysis, she wrote, "Historical accuracy does not prove reincarnational origin, but it significantly reduces the probability of childish fabrication." It was at this point that the case gained contours that would captivate any investigator. During a free observation session, Clara asked permission to touch a fabric placed on a table, a simple piece of white cotton used only for tactile tests. She smoothed it and said, "This one doesn't make a sound. Mine did." Kubler-Ross asked what kind of sound. The girl replied, "When I walked fast, the fabric told me to stop." The description coincided with the rustle of the obi, the traditional sash used to adjust the kimono, whose rigidity could emit specific sounds during movement. For Kubler-Ross, this type of detail, sensory, corporal, not visual, was particularly significant. Invented memories tend to be visual. Deep memories, whether of trauma or another nature, often include physical sensations. The therapist began to realize that the case went beyond the conventional psychological field. There was a historical, sensory, and behavioral coherence that deserved even more rigorous investigation. As the sessions progressed, Kubler-Ross decided to audio record each encounter, following clinical standards for documenting anomalous memory studies. The main concern was to maintain a faithful protocol, avoiding any form of suggestion. During one of these recordings, a simple scene ended up becoming one of the most cited moments later in academic presentations about the case. Clara was observing a vase with fresh flowers, a common sight in the office, when she said, almost in a murmur, "The lady of the house would change the flowers at dawn. If they withered before the time, it was our fault." Kubler-Ross, experienced in reading emotional states, realized that the girl was not demonstrating fear, but responsibility. It was the remembrance of a routine, not the evocation of a punishment. This type of distinction was essential for classifying the content as a non-traumatic narrative, despite being dense. The therapist then introduced a sensory association technique, asking Clara to describe the smell that most reminded her of that place. The answer was immediate: the smell of wet wood and faint smoke. Kubler-Ross noted that the description corresponded to the typical atmosphere of old tea houses heated by internal braziers, information later confirmed in ethnographic literature. These correspondences, however, were never mentioned to Clara, preserving the methodological integrity. The following sessions revealed a detail that would change the focus of the study. Clara described a specific street. She said it was narrow with large worn stones, and that the lantern swayed when the wind came from the river. Kubler-Ross said nothing, but after the session, she consulted historical maps of Kyoto preserved in public archives. She found records of alleys near the Kamo River where, in the Edo period, Maiko training houses were established. The similarity was notable. Even so, the therapist maintained her scientific stance, noting, "The child describes a scenario compatible with historical records. However, coincidences cannot be ruled out." The mother, on the other hand, was starting to get emotional about the precision of the accounts. During a follow-up interview, she recounted that her daughter had stopped in front of a Japanese store window in Munich and stood still for a few seconds, observing handmade kimonos. She didn't touch anything, didn't ask for anything. She just said, "This fabric is too heavy for training," and she kept walking. Kubler-Ross recognized the same pattern observed in other cases documented by Ian Stevenson. children spontaneously commenting on specific cultural details without demonstrating fascination, only familiarity. It was during this period that an unexpected clinical element emerged. Clara began to demonstrate relief when narrating certain memories. When describing repetitive tasks like polishing the floor or carrying water containers, she would take a deep breath and say, "I knew how to do that." The therapist interpreted this behavior as organized mnemic discharge, common in experiences of recall that provide a sense of mastery or identity continuity. The case, until then fascinating, gained a new layer when, on a quiet session afternoon, Clara spoke of something that seemed more intimate. Sitting in front of Kubler-Ross, she said, "I wasn't important, but I was good at listening." The statement touched the therapist, who always valued human listening in her own studies on finitude. She realized that there was more than just simple memory there. There was a persistent personality trait. The investigation was moving toward a conclusion that would require crossing clinical, historical, and phenomenological data. However, the most delicate part was still missing: understanding how these memories affected Clara's current life and what that might signify in the broader context of consciousness research. The final phase of Kubler-Ross's investigation focused not only on the origin of the memories, but on their impact on Clara's current life. To do this, the therapist conducted a series of behavioral assessments and interviews with educators, seeking to understand if there was functional interference, something common in clinical cases involving mnemic content of strong emotional intensity. The reports were surprisingly positive. The girl's teacher described her as centered, cooperative, and, above all, endowed with an unusual sensitivity for perceiving the emotional states of classmates. "She knows when someone is sad, even before the person speaks," the educator said. This empathetic profile drew the attention of Kubler-Ross, who related it to the girl's spontaneous comment weeks earlier. "I was good at listening." The most sensitive point of the study emerged when the therapist decided to explore how the child perceived the boundary between the two narrated identities, the current life and the life that emerged in the mnemic episodes. In clinical terms, this is a critical aspect for assessing the risk of structural dissociation, something that Kubler-Ross, with vast experience in humanist and palliative psychology, knew how to conduct with extreme care. In one of the most striking interviews, she asked Clara, "When you remember these things, do you feel like it's yourself?" The girl answered simply, "I feel like it's me, but in a different way, like I was lying down and woke up in another room." The response, analyzed later, would be considered one of the most notable elements of the case. There was no identity confusion, only continuity. The child distinguished the two realities, but recognized a persistent self. In her final notes, Kubler-Ross classified this as non-conflicting parallel consciousness. Based on the methodology consolidated by Ian Stevenson, who always advocated rigorous documentation before any speculation, Kubler-Ross cross-referenced Clara's accounts with historical records about the structure of entertainment and Miko training houses in the Edo period. The compatibility was high, especially in the details that escape popular knowledge: the rustling of the stiff obi, the smell of heated wood, the routine before dawn, the responsibility for the flowers, and the reference to the wind from the river. However, true to her scientific stance, Kubler-Ross never concluded the case as definitive proof of reincarnation. Instead, she described it as a phenomenon of non-ordinary memory with strong historical coherence, without an identifiable source in the current life. This formulation would later be cited in congresses on transdisciplinary psychology and consciousness studies. But perhaps the most human part of her clinical report was recorded at the close of the sessions. In the last interview, while the mother was talking to the therapist, Clara walked to the window and observed the outer courtyard, where some autumn leaves were accumulating. Without being prompted, she said, "I like it here. The air is light here." The simple phrase indicated something that Kubler-Ross valued deeply. The child was anchored in the present, despite the memories emerging from the past. Upon finalizing the case, the therapist wrote, "We cannot explain the origin of these memories. What we do know is that they brought not anguish, but continuity. The child is not divided, she is expanded." For Kubler-Ross, who dedicated her life to understanding the human experience at its limits, the study of Clara was not about proving reincarnation, but about recognizing the depth of consciousness, a theme that also ran through the work of Ian Stevenson and continues to challenge contemporary science. Thus, the case of the German girl who spoke of feudal Japan remains one of the most intriguing clinical records of that period. A unique encounter between memory, history, and humanity, conducted with the serenity and rigor that always defined Kubler-Ross's work.